E il terzo applauso che vi chiedo non è per Friedman e Fukuyama, che non avremmo mai invitato in questo palco, ma è per il premio Nobel Michael Spence, che ci raggiunge e fa la sua lezione qui. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I flew overnight from New York. I'll do my best. What I want to do today, when we don't have a lot of time, is talk about a fairly major set of changes in the global economy that are going to affect everybody. And so why don't I just jump right in? So we lived in a world in the past 3 decades, at least some people say 4, in which huge amounts of productive capacity were introduced into the global economy, basically by the emerging economies who are growing. It was a deflationary environment. There was almost no sign of inflation, certainly in the recent past. We lived with 0 interest rates and massive injections of liquidity with no sign of inflation. In fact, inflation was below the targets. I want to convince you in the first half of this talk that that's over. Now, that shouldn't, yes, I agree. Thank you. But even in markets now, you will find a common view that says, well, we're in a kind of tough inflationary fight, but when we're finished, the interest rates will come back down, and we'll be back where we were before. So when I'm teaching this in class, I ask myself, so ask yourself the following question. Would you bet a lot of money that once the inflation fight is over, and it will be over, the central banks will get it under control, we can go back to a world in which the interest rates are 0, and the central banks can buy assets, in unlimited quantity with no threat of inflation? Now, I think most of you, when you think about that, will realize that that's not going to be the world. This is a non-mean reverting, to use technical terms, a set of events. Now, and so what I want to try to do is to trace out the consequences of that, but first try to convince you that there's some powerful secular, meaning reverting forces that are causing this. And then I'll turn to a kind of set of revolutions in technology and so on that I think actually do have the power to reverse these rather large headwinds to growth. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but it relates to the previous discussion. For the first time in the last 15 years, thanks to Thomas Piketty, Emmanuel Saez, and a whole now host of people, we actually have really good data over long periods of time on the distributional characteristics of the global economy. It's a field that's important, not only economically, but socially and politically, and we were running with very little good data on that. As we had more time, I would explain what this is all about, but I'll keep going. And of course, we live in a world in which we are fighting the battle of our lives with respect to sustainability, and so far we're losing the battle. But what this graph says is there's an enormous amount of growth and growth potential in the global economy, and it's producing tons and tons of CO2. We're at 36 billion tons per year of CO2 emissions. That's approximately 3 times the level that we need to be even remotely in safe territory. We are going to blow through the 1.5 degrees Celsius intermediate target, at least for a while. And you can see, if you spend some time, I'll leave these behind, where this great growth in CO2 is coming from. It's coming from the emerging economies. This is China, by far, the biggest emitter. And these are the top emitters. You can see both the per capita numbers are a little different than the others, but this is, I don't know how to say it. In the last decade, the carbon intensity of the global economy declined at 2% a year. The growth was a little higher than that, so basically total carbon emissions were sort of flat. Maybe they'll peak. China says they will peak by 2030. Europe's coming down, the United States. finally got in the game and started to come down. But India has an enormous amount. India is the next China, right? There's enormous growth potential in front of it. We're not going to get it, we're not going to solve this problem with carbon intensity declines of 2% a year. We need 7, 8, and 9% to sort of meet the, International Energy Agency's targets. Okay, so what was the transitory mistake? The mistake was we got the global economy all twisted around and screwed up in the pandemic for reasons everybody in this room knows. And we thought when the pandemic ends and those, problems, blockages and so on unwind, then we'll go back to normal. And the central banks placed big bets on this. They said, basically, these are going to go away. We do not have to fight the temporary inflationary pressures associated with very large demand-supply imbalances. And they were wrong. Either the transitory factors didn't fade fast enough, or they weren't the total sum of the transitory factors. But some of them have faded, right? The graph on this is ocean shipping costs. They went from $2,000 per container, this is to cross the Pacific, to $10,000, and now they're back pretty close to $2,000. You all live in this world and know these numbers better than I do. China was never going to stay in zero COVID mode forever, and they didn't. The semiconductor shortages, which were ubiquitous and screwed up pretty much every industry, including automobiles, globally, that's largely subsided, not completely. But that has not taken away the sort of inflationary pressures. And so the central banks arrived late. The short story you all know, because they arrived late, they have raised rates at a tremendous rate. As discussed in the previous session, there's a generation and a half of people in the financial markets, in the regulatory agencies, and in business that have never lived in an inflationary environment. And mindsets, believe me, do not change overnight. This causes accidents. In America, we just had several regional banks who sort of failed to understand. Some of them explicitly said, we believed the transitory story until it was too late. And the asset values on the long duration side declined and the cost of funding went up, and there they were. But this is Mike Spence's list, so other people have different ones, of the secular factors that are running against any kind of supply-side response. The short version of the inflation story is we're getting no help whatever from the supply side of the global economy. It's just not elastic in the way it was before. And so the only game in town is the central bank that uses its policy instruments to reduce the demand side. That's what we're going through. That's why we're going to have slow growth until they finish the inflation fight. But I think it's a little more serious than that. So this powerful deflationary force we lived with before is fading, right? There aren't too many Chinas you can stick into the global economy. There's a fair amount of underutilized productive capacity out there, but it's kind of stuck and not integrating very well in the global economy. But in addition, there are a whole bunch of things. I won't spend a lot of time on this one, except to say we are moving from a world in which global supply chains were created almost entirely on efficiency and what economists call comparative advantage considerations, to a world in which economic and other kinds of security have been elevated, and businesses, backed up by policy at the country level, are busy diversifying these supply chains, to some extent bringing them home. And this is a very expensive process. And you don't have to say this to Europeans, because the most expensive one that's going on right now is the one we're in, the diversification away from dependence on Russian fossil fuels. But there are other factors. The global economy is getting old. Now, you might argue with me, but I actually have the data. So 1/3 of the world's population lives in aging societies. But those that 1/3 lives in countries whose economies account for almost 80% of global GDP. So it's true. The other 2/3 may eventually get big enough to override the sort of, aging effect. But right now, in the lion's share of the global economy, the workforces are flat or declining. The older group is getting bigger, fertility rates are very low, dependency ratios are rising, and there's fiscal distress and so on. And so I don't have time to go through all of these things, and some of them are related to geopolitical tensions. But there is one more, and that is there's a stunning decline in the rate of productivity growth, especially in the last decade, more or less everywhere. I don't think this is completely well understood, including by people who are like us in the economics profession who are supposed to understand that. The result of this is we're moving into a world in which the supply side is not going to help us. Labor markets are undergoing extraordinarily big changes in behavior. In America, the biggest employment sectors in the economy are government, healthcare, construction, hospitality, and conventional traditional retail. That's 45% of the employment in the American economy, in just 5 sectors. Every single one of them has significant labor shortages. Why? Because there's a whole generation of people, plus some older ones, who think working in those places is not flexible, can't work from home in many of those jobs. It's dangerous, it's stressful, and it's low paid. It's sort of what we call in America, no-brainer. Why would I want to do that? So the labor markets are holding us back. Now, when you talk to the financial market people, in the context of the inflation fight, they say, well, no, this is terrific. The labor markets are holding up. It makes the inflation fight harder. It's true, right? But from a growth point of view, it's holding us back. So these are the factors that we have to contend with. I would say if this was the whole story, then we are looking at least half a decade of pretty tough economic conditions, because there aren't a lot of things that I put up there so far that are kind of powerful forces operating in the other direction. So I don't have a lot of time left, so I'm going to talk about those forces that are coming. They're not going to arrive overnight, but they're incredibly powerful. So here we go. These are just some graphs that I brought. This is low productivity. These are the deflationary effects. You can see all the traded goods here declined in nominal prices, let alone real prices, over a 2-decade period, the kind of period of hyperglobalization. Anyway, I'll flash through all this stuff. It says what I just told you. This is sovereign debt. Because of the pandemic, we're now globally over 100% sovereign debt to GDP ratios in a rising interest rate environment. I mean, if you were designing something that was sort of not ideal, that's probably what you'd do. One of the major transformations in the world is something that everybody kind of knows in the back of their mind, and that is the center of gravity of the global economy is shifting east. This is a graph that Danny Kwa in Singapore produced. He produced it in 2008. The center of gravity was here, sort of roughly around Turkey, and he predicted it would move here. Those are the red dots are predictions. He's right. It is somewhere over here, vaguely related to India and China and so on. Now what I'm going to do is basically I'm going to flash through these things, but the headline or the title is there's a whole bunch of extremely powerful technologies and tools whose costs are declining and whose accessibility is increasing, and if we deploy them, they are powerful enough to turn these economic conditions that I described before around. This is the cost of solar. It's declined by a factor of somewhere between 5 and 10 within a decade, right? It's a major factor in why even though we're behind the curve, we might actually eventually win the sustainability battle. This is Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing. It's the roadmap for their semiconductors. It's a little out of date. The phone in your pocket is a 5-nanometer chip, if it's an iPhone. That's incredibly dense. What that means is a 5-nanometer chip over here has 171 million transistors per square millimeter on the chip. This is a supercomputer, basically. They can produce 3-nanometer chip now, and they say they're within shooting distance of 2-nanometer chips, and then they're going to layer them and double it. These are the chips that you need to do the training of these incredibly powerful artificial intelligence algorithms. They're also, by the way, energy efficient. This one I will not spend time on, because, in part because nobody knows about it. This is DeepMind's AlphaFold. The short version is they set out to predict the three-dimensional structure of proteins from the amino acid sequence that defines the protein, and they succeeded. And so there's something like 200 million known proteins. They've predicted pretty accurately their three-dimensional structure. This is just crucial if you're doing pharmaceuticals or vaccines or almost anything like that. And it's a public database, right? Anybody in the world can look it up. And here we have a trend I think is really important and needs to be paid attention to, which is I can remember not that long ago, maybe 15 or 20 years, you could count on the fingers of one hand the places that were the sort of tech-oriented hotspots for entrepreneurial activity and innovation and company building, high-growth companies. That's not true anymore. It's global. It's literally everywhere. The biggest players are still the United States. Second biggest is China. What this is a count of unicorns. You know what those are. These are private companies that fairly quickly acquire a value of $1 billion while they're still private. But India is a major player now. There's lots of activity in the UK. There's lots of activity in the north of Europe. There's 25 unicorns in Berlin and another 25 in Paris. And one of the things that I hope is, because Italy is a little bit behind on this, is that we see this. I don't have any reason to think we won't, but to see this kind of development here. And I guess I'll conclude on this because I'm going to run out of time. These are the stunning breakthroughs in artificial intelligence in the last decade or so. And you can see they're coming, they're ramping up faster, and every single one is more powerful. And I can assure you, having spent the last 5 months, I decided that learning about artificial intelligence by reading the Financial Times was the wrong way to do it. So since I have a background in Silicon Valley at Stanford, I decided maybe I ought to talk to the people who are building the technology. So I've been doing that. And in some ways, it's even more interesting than just reading about it. So we have handwriting recognition, ramped up fairly quickly, and speech recognition. The machines now recognize speech. And then a stunning set of breakthroughs in image recognition. Right? I mean, the AI looks at complicated image and can pick off a cat or a chair or anything like that. And you might say, who cares? Well, you can't have a robot that can't see, right? I mean, these are just fundamental building blocks. And then, and then we have this reading comprehension, and this last one is the one you associated with ChatGPT. These are large language models. And in every single case, when we have a benchmark test of average human performance, these have ramped up and exceeded average human performance. Right? And the stunning thing about this one is that it was trained on the internet. As an aside, it takes astronomical amounts of computing power to do this. There's probably 10 companies, maybe just 5, with cloud computing systems that are big enough to train these things. The full one, right? You're going to see lots of specific applications of this in lots of different areas. But it's this one, backed by these things, as building blocks that I believe creates the potential for an enormous productivity increase. TikTok, by the way, is an expert in using these kinds of algorithms. TikTok has, by the way, become the dominant player in online advertising, surpassing what used to be called Facebook, and now Meta. So just a little bit on where we're going with this. I think the potential is enormous for inclusive growth patterns. Will it be disruptive? I mean, most of the talk about is, will I have a job? If you survey young people, they sort of say, I'm a little worried about this. These technologies, let me put it this way, robotics is lagging behind because breakthroughs that are even more stunning than the ones you just saw are required to advance the robotics. Robotics still works best in very defined, structured environments. If you put a robot in an unstructured environment, it'll get lost. And they don't, that's a deep, deep problem that's not conceptually all that different from the problem of the big language models, but it's harder to solve. And so I think we're going to see essentially not job displacement, but big job changes in the knowledge part of the economy. It's a huge part of the economy. I don't mean, when I say knowledge, I don't mean science, right? I mean, you know, everybody that handles information, transactions, et cetera. It's probably everybody in this room. And it will be a productivity surge producing. I'll conclude these remarks by telling you, oh, this is cute. I'll leave this behind. I asked ChatGPT to tell me about the future of Singapore. They did a pretty good job. And no hallucinations, right? So hallucinations are interesting. Hallucination is the term the tech people use when one of these things makes something up. So, for example, Bard was asked to write an essay on inflation. Did a pretty good job. And at the end of the essay, it said, if you're interested in this subject, you might want to read the following 5 things that'll deepen your knowledge. And there were 3 papers and 2 books with plausible sounding titles. None of them existed, not one. So they do make stuff up. Now, for most people who care about facts, this is a problem. For the creative people, and you all deal with them, you want it to do this, right? So we're in the early stages of even sort of straightening out our conceptual understanding of this. The last thing I'll show you is a paper I'll tell you about, and I'll stop. Paper by my colleague at Stanford and a couple of co-authors. And they studied, I'm just trying to make this concrete for you. They studied the use of generative AI in customer service operation in a tech sector. So these customer service people were dealing with customers, you know, and they couldn't connect to the network, or the network went down, or, you know, et cetera, that kind of stuff. You've all had that experience. There's some automated versions of that. They don't work very well. So what they did is they took thousands and thousands of hours of audio recordings of these things and trained the AI on them. Again, using performance measures. You know, did this person solve the problem? You know, how long did it take to solve it? Did they make the customer really angry in the course of doing it? So some of it was sort of soft skills and whatnot. And, and then they tested it. And the way they tested it is they basically gave the AI as a digital assistant to a collection of agents arrayed in terms of experience, very experienced, high-performance metrics, down to very low experience, you know, fumbling around, having to ask the manager all the time what to do. And then the other group got nothing. And there's 2 conclusions from this, and they're both, to me, fascinating. Productivity increase was immediately 14%. You know, at 1%, that's 14 years of productivity growth achieved overnight, and I'm sure they haven't exhausted it. And the second one was even more interesting. Can you see me? If you array the customer service people in terms of experience and probable performance from the most experienced down to the least, the AI produced a little effect here and a huge effect here. It's a leveling technology. The way Eric and company describe it is it's like a very, very fast journey down the learning curve, right? And so that's pretty encouraging, right? It means you can deal with very challenging sort of problems of training people, you know, to do kind of fancy new things. So what I'm predicting, and then I'm going to stop before you shut me up.
No, I'm not.
What I'm predicting is that you'll see this over and over again in vertical and industry after industry. And my only recommendation is it's not easy. You don't want to jump into this, right? You don't want to do something crazy and make investments that don't have a return. But the worst mistake would be to ignore it. I mean, it's just way, way too powerful. Thank you.
Professor, stay, Professor.
Oh, I'm over here.
Here. The video. Okay, AI for me as a journalist is a nightmare. It's not a challenge.
I know.
It's a fucking nightmare, okay?
You think it's
and that's it. But now, listening to your speech and going back to the geopolitical and the scenario, I was wondering, but it will end that we'll regret the old globalization, according to you, or the legacy was so negative that there's nothing to regret?
No, what I think is very similar to your earlier and very insightful conversation, which is the old one worked great for a while. It had flaws, but it's not fit for purpose, right? In the new world, it doesn't deal with data. It doesn't, deal effectively with dual technologies that overlap, the national security agenda and so on. And so the challenge is not to try to go back to that old one so much as strengthen the institutions we have and have a kind of conversation that builds a new version over time that is respectful of these new conditions in the global economy. At least that's where I'm going. I don't think that's idiosyncratic. I mean, sensible people are trying to limit the contamination of the economic side from the national security side by focusing these limitations in areas like semiconductors and AI and so on to things that sort of really have a significant impact, but not,
And there is a second issue. I mean, I haven't heard your point of view on the labor market, or better, the impact of this transformation on the labor market.
Yeah, so it's very hard to give straight answers. So history tells us that you get a lot of turmoil when you have a big technology kind of injection into the way jobs are put together. I mean, the way most people think about this is you have jobs that are defined by a sort of set of activities you do. Relatively few jobs, either in this or previous generations of digital technology, were simply eliminated. There were a few. We don't have many filing clerks around anymore. And almost all general ledgers are, maintained digitally by a big kind of accounting system that's automated. But for the most part, you have some of the things are automated, and then people, learn to do a slightly different job and they get more productive. And the amount of disruption in any given area is a function of how much of the job you used to do has been turned over to a machine. My feeling is people automatically gravitate to automation, right? The machines take these things, right? Whereas I think, I wouldn't dismiss that, but I think the dominant impact in this case or in these cases, is going to be powerful digital assistance, right? I mean, honestly, I know you're a journalist. And these machines, I would worry more if I were a copy editor, right? Generating media copy, they'll do that. Computer programmers, I mean, the LLMs are good enough computer programmers. If that was the only effect in the economy, it would be big because software is a huge part of the economy. Are we going to get rid of software engineers? Oh, actually, this could be a big enough effect that we don't need as many of them. But when people say that, what they're doing is holding the demand side constant, right?
Yeah.
Okay? So if you hold the demand side constant and increase productivity a lot, you'll need fewer of those people. The question is, does the demand side really stay constant? And that's the part.
And that's the question.
Yeah, it's a question, and it doesn't have it doesn't have an answer that is the same for all sectors, if you see what I mean. I think it's probably not a good guess for software, but there may be some others where you'll have fewer people employed.
One last question. Some of your colleagues, they say, okay, this is an incredible revolution, a technological revolution, but it's nothing compared to what we went through at the end of 19th century and beginning of 20th century, because the Industrial Revolution, in terms of, second Industrial Revolution, was much bigger, much wider, and absolutely more of a revolution than the one we are describing now. First, do you agree? Second, are we exaggerating in describing this actual revolution?
I think the jury's out. Meaning, that's an American term. That means we don't know yet. Is this electricity? I think it would be hard to argue that this is as revolutionary as electricity in the economy. But we're not done yet. I mean, my main answer is we're not done. Sometime in this decade, we're going to see a set of breakthroughs in robotics that are similar to this, and then the digital footprint will start to get even bigger. So, sure, there's hype, right? There's a gold rush in the capital markets now. I wouldn't go invest in some of these things. I mean, the valuations are ridiculous. But I think there's a balance here, and it's wrong to dismiss it. That's the way I would say it.
Okay, thank you very much to Professor Michael Spence.